Squid Game, the most famous television series in the world right now. But what if I told you that Squid Game is based on a real story? A story much darker than the TV show, an internment camp, where homeless people, orphan children, and protesters were brought for torture. This is the story of the South Korean concentration camps of 1970s. Brothers Home, this brutal institution thrived during the authoritarian 1980s, a time when human rights were routinely ignored in South Korea. The horrors that unfolded there echo eerily through Squid Game's narrative, an environment where survival depends on playing twisted games within a dehumanizing system. To understand Brothers Home, we first need to understand the political climate of South Korea in the early 1980s. After a military coup in 1979, President Chun Doo-hwan came to power. His regime was marked by censorship, political repression, and violence. At the same time, South Korea was undergoing rapid modernization. The country was desperate to shake off its war-torn image and present itself as a modern, prosperous nation, particularly with the 1988 Seoul Olympics on the horizon. But there was a problem. South Korea's major cities were filled with what the government considered undesirables. These were homeless people, street vendors, beggars, orphans, people with disabilities, and even those who simply didn't have proper identification papers. To the government, they were an embarrassment, an eyesore that tarnished the image of a modern metropolis. Under the guise of urban beautification and social reform, authorities launched aggressive street-clearing campaigns. Police officers, often working with city officials, rounded up anyone who looked out of place. If you were poor, homeless, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time, you risked being taken away. The government called it a rehabilitation effort. In reality, it was a mass incarceration scheme. One of the largest and most notorious facilities where these people were sent was Brothers Home, located in the port city of Busan. At first glance, it seemed like a charitable institution. It claimed to offer vocational training and shelter to those in need. But this facade quickly crumbled once you stepped inside. The facility was surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire. Armed guards patrolled the grounds. There was no escape. At its peak, Brothers Home held over 4,000 inmates. Many of these people were imprisoned without trial or even formal charges. Children as young as 7 were detained alongside elderly men and women. Survivors have described the conditions as inhumane. Upon arrival, inmates were stripped of their belongings and often beaten as a form of initiation. Beatings were a daily occurrence. One survivor recounted how he was whipped for talking out of turn. Another described witnessing a man being beaten to death after attempting to escape. The psychological torment was just as severe. Inmates were frequently humiliated and forced to perform demeaning tasks. New arrivals were stripped of their names and referred to by numbers, effectively erasing their identities. One survivor said it felt as though he had ceased to exist as a person. But perhaps the most exploitative aspect of Brothers Home was the forced labor. The facility was essentially a sweatshop. Inmates were made to work long hours producing goods that were sold for profit. These included garments, furniture, and even toys. The profits went directly into the pockets of the facility's operators, including its notorious director, Park In-kun. Inmates were given no compensation for their work. They were barely fed and lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Disease was rampant. Some survivors remember the constant stench of unwashed bodies and overflowing latrines. Malnutrition was common, and many inmates developed serious health problems. The abuse extended beyond physical and psychological torment. Sexual violence was rampant. Female inmates in particular were vulnerable to exploitation by both guards and senior male inmates.
밤마다 성폭행을 당하면서 생활했고 있습니다.
Survivors have shared harrowing accounts of the trauma they endured, trauma that many carry to this day. And then there were the deaths. While official records are incomplete, it's estimated that hundreds of people died within the camp's walls. Some succumbed to disease and malnutrition, while others were beaten to death or died trying to escape. One particularly chilling account describes how a group of inmates attempted to scale the facility's walls. They were caught, dragged back inside, and beaten in front of everyone. None of them survived. To cover up these deaths, the facility reportedly buried bodies in unmarked graves. Families were rarely notified. In many cases, they didn't even know that their relatives had been sent to Brothers' Home in the first place. The disappearances left a lasting impact on countless families. So, how did such a place operate for so long without public outcry? The answer lies in the political climate of the time. South Korea was under a military dictatorship, and freedom of the press was severely restricted. But in 1987, a brave former guard at Brothers' Home decided he couldn't stay silent any longer. He leaked information to a local journalist who published a damning expose. The story caused a national uproar. Citizens were horrified by the revelations, and protests erupted across the country. The government was forced to take action. Brothers' Home was shut down, and its director, Park In-kwon, was arrested. But justice was incomplete. Park received a relatively light sentence, and many of the guards who had committed atrocities went unpunished. The victims, meanwhile, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For decades, their stories were ignored. In recent years, there has been a renewed effort to bring the truth about Brothers' Home to light. Documentaries, books, and investigative reports have shed new light on the horrors that took place there. Survivors have come forward to share their stories, demanding acknowledgement and justice. Their courage has sparked a national conversation about the dark side of South Korea's rapid modernization. Now, let's connect this to Squid Game. The show's creator, Hwang Dong-hyuk, has openly discussed how his work was inspired by the economic struggles and societal inequalities he witnessed growing up. While he hasn't directly cited Brothers' Home as an influence, the parallels are hard to ignore. Both Squid Game and the story of Brothers' Home highlight a system where human lives are disposable, where survival depends on playing by twisted rules. The dehumanization, the violence, the psychological trauma, all are eerily reminiscent of what happened at Brothers' Home. One of the most powerful aspects of Squid Game is its exploration of desperation. The characters are pushed to their limits, forced to make impossible choices. This theme resonates deeply with the survivors of Brothers' Home, many of whom were stripped of their dignity and left with no choices at all. But there's also a message of resilience. Just as the characters in Squid Game fight to survive, the survivors of Brothers' Home have fought to have their voices heard. Squid Game may be a work of fiction, but it reflects a brutal reality that once existed, and in some ways, still does. As we watch these stories unfold on screen, we must remember the real people who lived through such nightmares. Their voices deserve to be heard.